I'm delighted to be back on Careers in Discovery with James Field of LabGenius. James, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much, Tom. And you've got me on for the Halloween special, haven't you?
Oh, I have. Yes, it is Halloween today as we're recording this. And I love your costume, by the way, for those
Yeah,
who are listening and not watching.
yours as well, Tom. Yours as
Yeah,
well.
thank you very much. Um, those of you who are watching this on YouTube will have just seen what a terrible, terrible joke that was. Um, James, I'm really excited to talk about your journey in biotech, and of course, your career is inherently intertwined with the story of LabGenius, which is the company you founded 12 years ago now. I don't know if that number seems big and surprising.
Well, Mike, I was just thinking as I kind of logged on for this call, Microsoft Teams has this kind of blur your face
Oh
function,
yes.
and so I did kind of ratchet it down, so I'm looking a little bit younger than I actually am. Those, yeah.
Well,
But yeah, 12 years. It's a long time, and
mm,
I feel like I've learned so much as a scientist and as a human being over that period. I started the business whilst I was doing my PhD at Imperial
yes.
College, so many years ago. But it wasn't actually until we kind of got a seed round in 2018 that things really
Hmm.
really got going for us.
Yeah, I see. And I'm really interested in that initial period as well because I think it's it's a period where it's easy to give up and it's easy to not see the progress and especially if you're sort of cash constrained and things like that. So I'm really keen to come back to that. Because clearly, once that seed round was raised, there was, I'm sure it wasn't up and to the right completely in a straight line, but it more or less followed that pattern. But um, I guess, first of all, for those who aren't familiar, it'd be great to just talk a little bit about LabGenius as it is today. Obviously, machine learning focused on protein engineering. You've got this really fascinating platform that is almost fully iterative and automated and all this kind of thing. I'd just love to talk a little bit about that to start with, if that's all right.
That sounds great, Tom. So I think the impetus for starting this business was just a recognition that therapeutic proteins, specifically therapeutic antibodies, they're becoming more and more complex.
Hmm.
And as these molecules are becoming more and more complex, it gets harder for protein engineers like myself to really understand that link between how they're designed and how they work.
Yes.
And when I was doing my PhD, I was getting really frustrated because I felt like, isn't there this huge issue that the complexity of the therapeutics that we can make is somehow inherently linked to human cognition? And is there a way in which we could decouple that? And,
Okay.
and 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 so really the thesis behind LabGenius and the work that we're doing is really how do we accelerate the discovery of novel therapeutic antibodies? And we do that by combining very high throughput experimentation with machine learning. And
Hmm.
and that's this sort of closed loop engine that we've been building for the last few years.
Yeah, and there's more of this kind of, we had people from Relation on this podcast a little while back, and they talk about their lab in the loop, and I guess yours has more automation and robotics attached to it, I think, and it's more focused on protein engineering, but similar sort of context in that it learns from itself, it's iterative, it's able to kind of accelerate almost flywheel like as the experimentation goes on. Is that fair?
Yeah, and I think taking one step back, I feel like this is really the future of science, really,
Right.
where how do we set up these closed loop engines that are able to explore different solution spaces and ultimately find new therapeutics, new materials, new technology that kind of go beyond the limits of human cognition. And I feel like this is now being proved out across several different domains across the whole of science. It's a really exciting
Yes.
time to be a practitioner in the space.
Absolutely. And this concept that you mentioned of decoupling the complexity of therapeutics from human cognition, are you talking there about sort of our ability to pattern recognize the detail we're now able to go into to find different variables, or what's the kind of uh, tell me more
Yeah,
about
I
that.
mean, I'll give you some real examples here.
Mm,
Often the number of programs that you might work on as a really experienced antibody body engineer, it's still a fairly small number. And
right.
to any new project, you might bring rules of thumbs to the table that you've either seen in the academic literature or directly experienced yourself. Well, certainly what we've seen is the way in which these molecules behave is so context dependent, and that the only real way in which you can generate meaningful insights to the program in question is to generate the data within the course of that
Yes.
program itself. And so really this is the approach that we take, which is kind of like trying to remove as many human biases as possible, generating a lot of data, and then using that data to train models that understand the design space for these therapeutic antibodies, and then allow us to drive towards areas of high
Mm.
performance. And interestingly enough, when you do that, something quite special happens. You open up the design space, and you end up navigating to these high performing molecules, many of which actually have really quite non-intuitive designs. And I think that's something quite special, because when
Okay.
you take this kind of approach that's free from human bias, you end up in places that you never would have looked had you taken
Yes.
the conventional method.
Yeah, I see. So there's sort of an objective assessment of where these therapeutics should go and where that design should take you.
Yeah, and quite often we'll look at some of these high performing antibodies that come out of our process,
Mm.
and really we'll say, like, we would have never have designed this ourselves. And then it will be a challenge for us to kind of unpick how they work, understand the exact mechanism of action, and from that comes new scientific knowledge as well.
Yeah. And 90% of the people listening to this, or perhaps more, are scientists. And I'm sure a lot of them are thinking, James, this sounds fascinating, but what then is the role of the scientist in this whole process?
Yeah, I mean, and it's a great question. And I think, when I see more and more people building these closed loop engines
Mm.
for discovering new science, it does make us think, where is it that human scientists can create that the most leverage? And the thing I would say up front is it's not the case that human scientists are going to go away. I would say
Right.
it's more the case that they are integral to this change in the way in which we are doing science. And so in the case of LabGenius, our scientists play a couple of different roles. The first
Mm.
is they are the ones designing and building the platform.
Right.
So
Yes.
they are building the engine, um, and often running the engine as well. And the
Hmm.
second piece is they bring a tremendous amount of scientific insight into how to frame what effectively becomes a search problem.
Yes.
So when we're looking through antibody design space, we might test or explore spaces that are, say, 10 to the 5 to 10 to the 6 unique antibodies that we want to evaluate in the context of complex disease relevant cell-based assays. Now, that sounds like a big number, but it's actually a tiny number
Hmm.
relative to the number of antibodies that could exist. And it's also the role of the scientific team to set the bounds of that search process. And that's
Yes.
something that
Okay.
you can only do when you have a huge amount of breadth to your scientific knowledge.
Yeah. Okay. So there's and I suppose this is an inherent problem that we've had in drug development up and down the life cycle of it for years and years, is that there's so much complexity to the entire process, however, so much depth to each part of the process that it's very, very difficult for people and even organizations to bring enough context to make, especially the early stage decisions well, right, in terms of target selection or which indication or all these kinds of things. But there's such inherently critical decisions. So perhaps is, if I'm understanding correctly, what this allows people to do is retain that domain expertise because they have to point it in the right place. But they can go deeper into the search, as you say, while perhaps even developing their breadth of knowledge, breadth of context to make better decisions in the overall drug development process. Is that kind of, am I
That's
understanding that right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, in my view, that it's still the scientist who's driving the process, in the
Mm.
sense that they're saying, look, this is the disease we want to go after. This is the
Yeah.
target we want to go after. Here's a molecular product profile. And actually, these closed loop engines, they're so you need a lot of investment to set them up.
Hmm.
Uh, and actually, the types of questions they can answer typically are quite narrow. So
Right.
in the case of the system that we're running for our internal programs, the big question that we're using the system to answer is, how do we engineer these therapeutic antibodies so that they can have exquisite selectivity for disease cells over healthy cells? How
Mm-hmm.
do they sample multiple different receptors on the surface of disease cells and identify which cell to kill and which cell not to kill? Now, um, there are lots of different ways that you can do that, but it only makes sense to level a kind of platform at specific problems where all of the conventional methods have failed. And I would say that's another really key important piece to take home here, which is there are lots of different ways in which you can deploy artificial intelligence and machine learning. Not all of them are equal, and so
Yes.
if you're going out to build a platform like this, you have to make sure you're working on the hard problems that can't be solved using conventional methods.
Yeah, absolutely. And this wasn't a question I prepared you for, James, so apologies. But we sort of touched on it before we started recording. Obviously, with your kind of platform, clearly, there's been a huge amount of acceleration in the capability of generative AI and large language models and things like that recently. Has that had much impact on how you do things, or is it a sort of separate discipline? What's been the sort of knock-on effect?
Yeah, so there are definitely useful tools that have come out of that whole
Mm,
wave. But if you look at many of the tools, ChatGPT, etc., those sorts of things, they're reliant on data that already exists.
right.
These are large models that are trained on existing data. A challenge that we face as scientists is arguably some of the most interesting questions that we want to answer. There's no data,
Yes.
and so that's where an engine like the one that we have at LabGenius becomes particularly important
Mm,
because it allows us to generate very high quality, what we call machine learning grade data that we can then use to train bespoke models for the specific questions that we want to answer. And I would say a big challenge that we faced is how do we integrate the data generation capability, so all of the robots that we have conducting these experiments, with the software infrastructure and the data
mm.
science, so that we can really robustly and systematically generate the data, train the models, and explore these design spaces.
Yeah, interesting. Yes, without that data, the capability doesn't matter, right? Or it never actually comes into existence in the first place because nothing's trained.
That's right, and
Yeah.
I think if you're trying to build one of these engines, a big kind of organizational challenge that you have is how do you bring together all of the different disciplines that are required to do that? So,
Mm,
for us, that means bringing together a team of data scientists, software engineers, molecular biologists, synthetic biologists, assay development experts,
yes.
and structuring your team such that all of those very different disciplines with different languages can collaborate really effectively together.
Mm, yeah, absolutely. And we'll talk about that, I think, as we talk about the journey of Lab Genius, and it'd be interesting to talk about how how those different pieces work together. I could stay on this part of the topic, by the way, for the entire conversation, so I'm going to wrench myself away, um, and talk a little bit about earlier on and sort of the origins of this path for you, James. So, trained as a synthetic biologist, protein engineer, why science in the first place? Why biology? Why protein engineering? Why this path for you, do you think, originally?
I mean, I've always loved biology. And so, it was pretty clear to me that I wanted to study biology and microbiology as an undergrad.
Hmm.
But when I'd finished that undergraduate degree, I was actually ready to go out and get a job in
Right.
the city. And it was only when I was pulled into something called the iGEM competition, which is the
Hmm.
International Genetically Engineered Machine Competition, that I started to look at things differently. And I had this shift in perspective. So, what the iGEM competition taught me and showed me is that biology is not just a descriptive subject. It's something that where we can actually be really creative and build new biological compositions of matter, and that
Yes.
that was accessible to everybody. And that was a real shift for me. And off the back of that, I ended up doing a master's and PhD in protein engineering, and that was what originally set me on this path to building LabGenius.
Yeah. So tell us about how that came about then. So the I'm sure it wasn't just sort of you woke up one day and registered the company and got going. So, what was the
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, I had this really unique experience as a PhD student at
Mm,
Imperial, where I had some great PhD supervisors who just gave me a huge amount of latitude to go and effectively run my own project in their
right.
labs. And I started designing these really complex proteins that I was going to build. I got the synthetic DNA, stitched it together, produced this novel protein, and nothing worked as it should, as it should. And and it was really at that moment that I realized, me as a human, we've all evolved to kind of deal with matter at the macro scale. My brain like simply wasn't engineered so that I could handle that complexity of what's going
Right.
on at the nanoscale. And it was just at the time when the cost of DNA sequencing and synthesis was coming down
Hmm.
really rapidly. We were getting all of these new bits of automated kit in the lab, and the power of compute really was rapidly improving. And it
Yes.
really became clear that at the confluence of those different technologies, there was an opportunity to create an integrated platform that could solve the challenge of protein engineering far better than I could. And so that
Yeah.
was I guess, the insight or the moment where I thought, hey, look, I've got a kind of once in a lifetime opportunity here to build something. And that was the point at which I incorporated the company. But
Okay.
as I say, it was several years.
Mm,
I was still a PhD student at the time, and it was several years before we actually got any financing to get the thing off the ground.
yes. That original insight is probably the key inflection point, right? In that, your recognition that um, the complexity needed to really engineer these things at the nanoscale was not compatible with what you're able to um what do you call it, not cognition, not cognite, what you're able to do with your own brain. I'll take it more into more simple language. um that's quite a sort of moment of insight there. Do you remember much about that? Was it quite obvious to you? What, I don't know that many people would make that leap.
It was, I think it was an interesting moment
Mm,
because often you don't think of something unless you have examples around you of where the thing has been done before.
mm,
And I remember just kind of walking around the South Kensington campus, which is largely concrete, but there are a few trees there as well, and looking at the trees and thinking, you know, in some ways you could look at this tree as a solution to a problem of how to collect as much light as possible, with the leaves kind of arrayed as they were,
mm.
and it was, that was the moment where it was like evolution, which is this completely blind process, has created all of these examples of amazing complexity. But it's a very long, drawn out process.
Yes.
But what it shows us is that these incredible solutions exist. And I guess the insight that I kind of had at that point was, um, if there's anything that you can imagine, imagine someone had never imagine someone had never heard of dinosaurs and you were to describe a dinosaur to them, they would think that's ludicrous. But anything that you can imagine, there probably is some way to encode that into DNA and for that organism to exist. And
Yes.
so if you're starting at if your starting outlook is all of the organisms or biological molecules that you could think of already exist in some space that's not the space that we live in,
Mm,
but they exist theoretically, then it's not an engineering challenge you're trying to solve, it's a search problem.
okay.
And then it becomes, if it's a search problem you're trying to solve, then it instantly becomes much more tractable because you know
Mm,
that there's a solution out there. And when I was setting up the original platform, the EVA platform that we built, this is what the intent of the platform is. It's to search through a design space to find high performing molecules, just in the way that evolution searches through sequence space to find
mm.
high performing genetic designs. And I think that for me was a really nice framing because it kind of made me realize, look, I'm not trying to solve an impossible problem here. I'm just trying to search for a solution that already exists.
Right. Yeah, okay. And I suppose, as you say, you're at that confluence of timing where suddenly the availability, the cost, the power of compute is at a point where actually, you know, 20 years earlier, you might have recognized that and gone, yeah, but I haven't got a billion years to wait for this process to happen. But suddenly, perhaps in a rudimentary way to start with, but this conducting this process is actually possible in a realistic time frame, and that window of time has opened up, I suppose.
Yeah, and I think that's a really, really important observation, Tom, because the idea of a robot scientist, you know, I'm not the first person to come up with the idea. There's
Right.
a really rich heritage of folks who have independently kind of come across that as a really compelling idea. what was different was, I think I was at the right place at the right time,
Mm,
and just that right set of circumstances. So I was able to actually have a shot at building this in a space where we could have some real impact.
yes, yes, and Imperial being such a multidisciplinary place that, as you say, it's right in the right the center of the right things, I suppose.
I think it was both the fact that I was working in a very multidisciplinary
Mm,
environment, but also there was this idea that synthetic biology could be different, and I think that's just as important. This kind of cultural piece where had they called it just biotechnology, then I think you would be thinking about things far more conventionally. But
right.
because they gave it a new name and a new sort of it was branded as a new discipline, I think that really did actually encourage people to think differently
Interesting.
about it. And I think that's something I've kind of carried forward when thinking about building organizations, which is the way you frame things and the way you frame
Mm,
problems is really important to kind of foster an environment of creativity, because solving scientific problems ultimately comes down to a creative problem.
yeah. The language of that's critical, isn't it? And whether it's in research or in building an organization. I was reading something recently about high performing organizations and how they title things and how they name things, and that there's actually a really common thread. They don't use the same words necessarily, but the kind of the core of the language is all around a sense of belonging, looking after each other, that kind of thing. So, if you, I didn't know this until I read it, I think yesterday morning. Aircraft carriers, pilots don't land on aircraft carriers; they're recovered onto aircraft carriers. Um,
Interesting.
and those sorts of pieces of language that just inherently show people that they need to look after each other are really, really powerful subconsciously. And I guess it's the same sort of thing there. If you give something different terms, you can, as you say, you can cast off people's preconceptions about it.
100%. And I think it comes down to like how you foster environments so that there are moments where you can team of people can think very divergently, but then also in
Mm,
moments where you have to really converge, and it's all about sort of execution. And as a biotech, the constant challenge is how do you walk that line between blue skies, divergent thinking, and right, we've got to put our heads down now and we've just got to execute.
yes, yeah. And so then tell us a little bit about those early days, because as you said, there was a period before you brought a lot of capital into the business and you were finishing your PhD, and it probably wasn't the shiny futuristic labs that we saw on BBC at that point. What was the sort of first iteration of LabGenius then?
Yeah, you're right. It was very, very different. So it was sort of um, me kind of scrabbling together, getting together any cash that I could.
Yeah.
So I would I was working in a hall of residence at the time, so I didn't have to pay rent, tutoring, trading stocks and shares to get a little bit of extra money. Anything I
Okay.
could that would just generate a bit of money to finance the business. And at the same time, writing grant application after grant application, getting
Hmm.
rejection after rejection, just trying to get this any money I could together to at least run some experiments. And um, uh, it really came down to my wife actually, who was pregnant with our first child. She said, "Look, James, you've really been at this a while now. You've either got to raise some money, or you've got to get a real job."
Yeah.
And so that was the kind of that you everyone works to a deadline, and that was my
Hmm.
my deadline. And I actually closed the seed round for our seed financing from the hospital car park.
Oh, really?
So
Just made
uh,
it.
just made it. Yeah, just made it.
That's well, what a day though. What a day
What
for
a
you.
yeah, what a day. What a day.
That's fantastic. Yeah, there's nothing quite like that to focus the mind. Um, okay, so then you've got some seed capital. You're ready to start going. You've also got a new baby, so life has changed as well in lots of different ways. Um, and then that's I guess what 6 years ago or so now, 6 7 years ago. So I'm not going to ask you to take us sort of day by day, month by month through that journey, but what I am particularly interested in is you went from having had this insight, having worked on this problem, and I imagine some of the work you did in that first 4 years really helped to lay the foundations for what you've done since then. You would hope. Uh, uh, Tell us about since then how the company's evolved, but I'm also particularly interested in what you've had to learn about building and leading an organization, because what you're doing now is very, very different to what you were doing when you walked into that car park. Or sorry, drove into that car park.
Yeah, it's, I mean, very different. So, you know, I was trained as a scientist,
Mm,
running experiments at the bench, doing a little bit of programming here and there. Um, that's my skill set. And, that's not the skill set of a CEO. So,
mhm,
my journey over the last few years has really been around, how do you build and grow and finance a business. Now, luckily, that all doesn't come at once. In the sense that with every financing round, you get your bit of capital, you have to kind of hit your milestones,
yes.
and then if you're successful, then things ramp up. And so that's really been the journey for us. And what's fascinating is when I look at the organization today, just to kind of observe how different it is from when we started out.
Mm,
So, you know, we've got a team now where we've got the very brightest, best minds from the whole gamut of science and technology, from biotech and pharma, working hand in hand with really cutting edge equipment to build a platform of the
mm,
future. And that's a very different place from when we started out. But as I say, I think you don't have to solve all the problems overnight. You get
no.
there, step by step. But when I reflect on that journey, I think there are definitely a lot of things that we could have done better. We could have, and areas where we could have moved faster. And I think a lot of that comes down to me reflecting on where I could have accelerated my own learning.
Yes.
Um, and I would say, one thing that I wish that I'd done earlier is surround myself with mentors who had sort of walked that path before. So when I look at the people in my life who really helped me accelerate the business, it's a handful of people who took a bet on me and were very generous with their time. Early investors, our
Hmm.
chairman, members of my executive team, leaving great jobs to join us at LabGenius. Those are the people who really have accelerated our journey.
Yeah, and it's one of the things that I sort of noticed about the business when I first encountered it. Actually, was it's more common now, but it wasn't so much when I first stumbled across LabGenius maybe 4 or 5 years ago. You had built this very experienced executive team, brought in a very experienced chairman with track records of success and things like that. I think um, investors are almost demanding that now from companies, but there was less onus on it back then. That that must have been a decision that you made to sort of accelerate your development, right?
But I think, on reflection, I wish I'd made those decisions earlier. And I'll give you
Right.
some kind of really concrete examples,
Yeah.
which are, when I look at the makeup of our early team, um, uh, you know, the team was built by the folks who had done their masters and PhDs on the benches around me. Now,
Yes.
the reality is those were the very best people that I could bring into the organization at the time, and they were incredibly hard work, incredibly loyal, and LabGenius wouldn't be where it is without them.
Hmm.
Um, but at the same time, I wish I'd maybe been braver in those early days to go out and go to the big biotech and pharma companies and say you need to quit your job and come and work for
Yeah. Yeah.
LabGenius, and here's why. And I think the a key learning that you go through as a founder and a CEO is to try and be brave and
Mm.
to go out and to ask people who you really respect and maybe even feel a little bit intimidated by.
Yes.
um, because at the back of your mind you've got the imposter syndrome of why is this person going to quit their job, and
100%.
step into a much smaller organization with a CEO who until recently he has never had a job.
Yes.
So these are all kind of hurdles you have to get over, if you really want to be successful and build a successful business.
Yeah, I had exactly the same experience, and I remember when we started hiring here for the first sort of round of hiring, I had I think 3 or 4 people in a day coming in for an interview. And I remember walking into work that morning and going, but it's just me in a room. Like, what? How am I going to pitch this? I don't really. And you're right. You have that inferiority complex about the whole thing, don't you? But it's easy to forget that you've done something that a lot of people haven't at that point.
And also easy to forget how so many people hate working in large organizations, and they're
Yes,
actually
yes.
itching to get out and take more risk and try something new. And that's
Yeah.
the other side of it. Having never had a job before, I didn't realize how many incredible innovative people are trapped in large organizations
Mm,
just looking to
mm-mm.
make a move into something smaller and more dynamic.
Yes, absolutely. And you mentioned that the skill set that you had was not the skill set of a CEO, and I think that's true of a lot of founders. They have to develop that skill set. A lot of technical founders tend to face a fork in the road as to whether they do follow that path and stay in charge of the company and become the CEO, or they take a more technical role, a more scientific role. Was that ever a question for you, or was it always, no, I'm on this path, I'm taking this route?
I think it's a challenge because, I am a
Mm,
technical founder. I think maybe one thing that actually stood me in good stead is because the undertaking of our business is so inherently multidisciplinary.
right.
It became really rapidly apparent to me that very soon on, I was no longer the expert on the
Yes.
software side or the wet lab side. And it was only through, when you're hiring in people who really just kind of, can knock your socks off in terms of the depth of their knowledge in those disparate areas, you sort of think, okay, I better
Mm.
step back and give those folks some space, and then try and focus on the things where I can add value. I think that probably happens less in a business where, the technical founder can sort of be the architect of the organization
Yeah.
on the technical basis for longer. Um, yeah.
Yeah. If they're always the person who is the foremost expert in that particular discipline, I guess it's more challenging to hand that off. So so with that in mind, then, you talked about bringing in people around you who you could learn from. What have been the other key things that you've had to learn? Do you think the sort of key most important development points or transitional experiences for you?
Yeah, I think just the observations would be, um, if you're coming directly from an academic background like I did, you're rewarded and trained to innovate at every possible opportunity.
Hmm.
Now, the reality of building a business is that you need to be really intentional around where you take technical and scientific risk.
Yes.
And I think it's the case that you need to be really clear on your mind around what what is the unsolved problem that you're trying to address, and then everything else, why are you taking risk innovating in that area? And I think um, that sounds incredibly obvious, but when you've been trained day in day out to
Mm-mm.
kind of be rewarded for innovation on every front, that's a mindset shift that you have to get over. And I would say the maturation of many scientific teams when they're coming out of research institutions is one where there is this kind of gradual focusing down on the one problem that they can solve that
Yes.
nobody else can. And so for us, when I started the company, it was very broad. I was, in theory, you can apply the technologies we're looking at to any type of protein.
Right.
Now we're incredibly focused down on therapeutic antibodies, looking at,
Hmm.
at least in the context of our wholly owned pipeline, looking very specifically around how we optimize these molecules to address issues around on-target off-tumor toxicity across T-cell engagers, ADCs, etc. So we have a much kind of tighter focus, and that's
Yes.
something that's come as the technology's matured and the team's matured as well.
Yeah. I think it's a really important point. You are going to get much further as long as you pick the right problem. You're going to get much further by becoming the absolute number one in the world at solving that specific problem than being pretty good at solving three or four, right? And it's hard to keep that discipline sometimes, though.
Yeah, and I'd say especially when you're working in an area that's sort of looking at applying machine learning and AI to the engineering of novel biological molecules, because there are many different ways in which you can deploy those sort of
Mm,
technologies in this space, but not all of them are equal.
right.
There are actually lots of problems where conventional methods are actually like they work perfectly. There's no requirement to actually improve them using machine learning or whatever, and it can
Hmm.
actually be more expensive if you try. So I think, again, really focusing down on what are the really unsolved problems, and then making sure that your technology really does give you a competitive advantage in that space is key.
Yeah, it's interesting. I see this a lot, not in biotech specifically, but sort of across the board, and particularly in consumer products. You see a lot of technology now being applied to things that aren't actually a problem, as you say. It's sort of, yeah, you could do it with an app, but don't really don't really need to. There's not really much benefit in that beyond doing it with an app. Um, it's
But I
it's an
think that
interesting thing.
when
Yeah.
it comes to kind of motivating and empowering teams, having a mission where we are working on therapies that we
Mm.
hope in a couple of years will be entering the clinic, being used to treat patients with cancer. That's something that everybody in the team finds so motivating. And I think, again, when you're looking to compete as any business, to hire this great talent on in the data science and the software side, on the wet lab side, having a mission that everybody can relate to. That's something that I think that we as biotech companies certainly have going for us.
100%. A question I have for you, and I don't know if this is something you've thought about. I suppose as the relationship between people and technology changes, you've spent 12 years, you and your team shaping this technology that has formed Eva. How do you think the technology has shaped how you think as a scientist and as a leader, and what's been the sort of feedback cycle of that?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question. I think um, the fundamental shift really is going from one where our success isn't around trying to solve the problem ourselves as individuals. It's around how do we frame the problem, and
Mm,
that something applies at both to the whole company, but also every individual in the company, and in terms of how they behave and they act. And so,
mm.
I think there's a good learning there for a CEO, which is, maybe when you're a one person company, you have to solve all the problems.
Yeah.
But as a CEO, actually, often your job is to frame the problems in a way
Yes.
that folks who are much smarter and more experienced can solve those problems. And I like the fact that that's a generalized rule that what we can all apply to our lives, but it's
Mm.
actually at the heart of how we discover these novel biological molecules as well.
Yeah, I think it can be a challenging transition, right? Going from directly impacting the result, whatever that result might be, if it's a sales number you're trying to hit, or if it's a project you're trying to deliver, or something you're trying to do in your personal life, to focusing on creating the environment that delivers the result.
Mm.
I think the latter is much more difficult, um, but ultimately more productive, especially if you're trying to do something significant or solve a big problem.
Of course, the frustration comes from the fact that most CEOs and founders are very action oriented
Well,
individuals, and
yes,
you
yeah.
know you got to constantly pull yourself back because you want to jump in and solve all the problems and have everything sorted yesterday. So that's definitely a tension that we all kind of juggle with.
Exactly, exactly. It's when the team come back to you and go, and you've said, "What's going on with this?" Same as it was 10 minutes ago, Tom. Yeah. Um, so for people, James, who might be listening to this, who are perhaps in a similar position that you were at when you were sort of in the second half of your PhD at Imperial, they've had an idea, they're thinking about building a company around it, or have an ambition to be a founder at whatever stage they are in their career. What would you say has been either the best piece of advice you've had, or the thing that surprised you most about building a company that you didn't expect?
Yeah, I would say the two things that maybe sound a little bit contradictory. The first is, if you're going to work on a problem, make sure it's a problem that you're happy
Mm,
to work on for the next decade.
hmm.
And I can't emphasize that enough. Um, so there's that piece. The second piece is that the company will feel like a new company every 3 months.
Right.
And so, you know, when I look back, there's been the constant mission there. We're looking to develop
Yeah.
these therapeutic molecules to make a real difference in people's lives, and that's been the thing that for me has been most motivating and kept me working day and night on this. But there's also the piece which is that sense of renewal that you get every 3 months, where you feel like you're in a fundamentally different business because you're growing and you're innovating. And with that comes that feeling of opportunity there as well, in the sense that
Hmm.
there are things that you can change and you can constantly mold and shape the organization as it grows. And those two ideas are quite contradictory, but I feel like they can both be true at the same time.
Yes, you're sort of talking about ensuring that the core of what you're trying to do is constant while continually looking for new, better, different ways to do it.
That's right. And of course, the flip side, that is a failure mode I see of so many companies, is where they might kind of hang on too tightly to some aspects of an organization that are
Mm,
actually disconnected from the real mission of it, and then be pivoting their mission from X to Y to Z, and ultimately you end up flailing around. So I think getting it right from the outset, knowing that here is a problem that you want to work on for the next decade of your life, and then leaning into the fact that organizationally things will evolve and change,
yeah.
is part of the process.
I think that problem selection is so crucial, right? It's kind of that's the thing that's going to keep you when everything looks bleak, because there will be moments where you're kind of trying to figure out how much is left on the credit cards and all this kind of thing, and your wife's telling you to get a real job and all that kind of stuff, where there are those moments where you sort of question it, but it's that I've always found it's that return to, but I have to solve this problem for people. Like, I have to do this for people. This is too important for me not to do it. That's the thing that's going to get you through that, I find.
I think that's true. I will also admit that something quite something happened to me quite early in the business, which
Mm,
was, we were in a bit of a financially sticky spot, and this is when I was still a PhD student or just finished, and my two younger sisters, they said, "Don't worry, James, we're gonna invest the inheritance from our late grandmother into the business,"
right.
and now having raised $75 million, it's obviously a tiny, tiny, tiny sum, but at the time, it was a huge amount of money, and sort of
Mm,
symbolically, when you're taking money from your younger sisters to kind of invest in the business, at that moment, it really forged this completely irrational decision that I would just stick at this no matter what. And
yes.
there have been multiple points on the journey where, I don't know, you're at a real low point and somebody comes in and says, "Hey, I can give you this job offer for this, sum of money that, your family's going to think, wow, and it's going to change your life." But that completely irrational
Hmm.
decision of like, look, I'm just going to stick at this no matter what. I think that has been just as important. And if I hadn't had that, I think, there are many different
Yeah.
versions of the way things could have played out that meant that we wouldn't have been having this conversation here today. So I think it's also important to acknowledge that, um, if you want to kind of build and grow a business as well, it has to be something deep inside you that is quite irrational, in order to motivate you to get over all of those low points and break through those barriers that you inevitably will face.
Yeah. There's a real dichotomy, isn't there, between sort of the need to be logical and thoughtful and to plan things effectively and to be strategic and to sort of, you know, weigh risk, mitigate risk, do all the sort of sanguine, wise things that you have to do to build a business. And sometimes just to go, do you know what? Let's just do it. I don't, it doesn't make any sense, but we have to do it and we have to push on.
Yeah, and I think especially as a scientist, it's easy to over rationalize stuff,
Yeah.
and just forget it. At the end of the day, look, we're all animals, and so much of human behavior, it's not what you said to somebody, it's how you made them feel in the conversation that they're
Yes.
basing a decision over. And it's just as much as true in the way that we conduct ourselves and make our own decisions and govern our own lives. So yeah, it's something to recognize.
Absolutely. Are your sisters happy with their valuation now?
They're constantly asking me. Well, one's an artist. One's an artist, and she says, "James, you're doing great stuff." The other one's in private equity, and she's saying, "James, when can I get my return?" So two very different sisters, who I love equally, I should say, for the record.
Just so in case they're listening, yes.
Yeah.
And no, you don't want to meet her boss just yet. Yeah. Um, James, it's been fabulous to speak to you. Can you tell us a bit about what's next for LabGenius?
Yeah, so as I say, Tom, we built out what I believe is a world-leading platform to discover
Hmm.
these new therapeutic antibodies. We're looking at these molecules and we're seeing some really exciting results. We're seeing molecules that can completely differentiate between healthy and disease cells and selectively kill these cancer cells beautifully. The next part of the journey for us is translating those molecules into the clinic, where we can see that they
Yes.
make a real difference to patients' lives. So um, stay tuned, and I'm looking forward to keeping you updated on our journey.
No, please do, and we wish you the best of luck, James. It's been an amazing journey so far, and long may it continue.
Thanks very much, Tom.